Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Lancet Voice. I'm here with my co-host Gavin Cleaver. Today we're talking about death. If you've recently suffered a bereavement, you'll notice that our tone for the most part is cheerful. This is not to diminish the loss that death brings, but because the work discussed here is trying to explore a new relationship with death. But if you're in the acute phase of grief, this episode might not be right for now. As always, if you'd like to reach out to Gavin or I to discuss, please get in touch with us on our Twitter handles, @Jessamy Bagenal or @Gavin Cleaver.
Thanks, Jessamy. So today we're going to be talking about a new commission from the Lancet called The Value of Death. It asks and attempts to answer some of the big questions about death, like what is a good death? How has our relationship with death changed over the last few years? What can we practically change in our health system about how people die for the better? To find out how we can better come to value death, Jessamy spoke with some of the commissioners. So you'll hear her speaking to Dr. Richard Smith, who's former editor of the BMJ, Dr. Libby Sallnow, a palliative medicine consultant, and Dr. M.R. Rajagopal, chairman of Pallium India and director of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Policy and Training on Access to Pain Relief.
I mean, we're so excited to have you here. Everybody at the Lancet is extremely excited about this commission, and it's great to have this sort of, 4 or 5-way conversation. Richard, maybe I could start with you. I mean, how did this commission start? It's an unusual topic for a medical journal.
It started really with the conviction that there's something very wrong with our relationship with death, that the relationship might be described as unhealthy. I mean, death is part of life. It's a very important part of life. And what was interesting, when I talked to people, all sorts of people, doctors, nurses, patients, people who've had family experiences, almost everybody agreed, something is wrong. There weren't people who said to me, well, there's no problem here at all. What on earth are you talking about? And I think we started a lot with the idea that there was this sort of excessive treatment at the end of life, a tendency to go on and on beyond the point that really made sense, increasing rather than decreasing suffering. And then when we began to think about it more broadly, we realised that also somehow death had just become far too much the business of doctors and nurses and health professionals, that it had moved away from the community, which is where it used to be probably until about the 1950s. And we were very interested to analyse the difference between how people died and how people thought about death in the 1950s and how they think about it now. And there's been a very dramatic change, not least in the way that people die. I mean, in those days, deaths were often faster, came earlier. Now often death is a very prolonged process. So the nature of death has changed. And in a way, society and the health system haven't responded, which actually in some ways is what you see in the health system generally. It was set up to deal with acute conditions and trauma, and it doesn't cope very well with what the predominant problems are now of long-term chronic conditions.
I mean, in my head, I've got this sort of tension between high-income countries and lower middle-income countries when we're talking about this. Maybe we'll park that for later, because I think we can talk about that later in terms of the unnecessary deaths that also go on in the world, even though in some places we're hanging on to life. But I think this work started before COVID-19. What kind of a lens has the last 2 years put on this work?
Well, yes. I mean, when the pandemic broke, and people were very concerned about what was going to happen. There was an expectation of huge numbers of deaths. Our initial reaction was, oh my goodness, who on earth is going to want to hear anything about the value of death in these awful circumstances? And we had a meeting of the commissioners online, and we sort of started almost with the idea that we might have to abandon all of this. But very quickly, within that conversation, which went on for an hour or two, we came to the opposite conclusion, that actually, if we had moved to the kind of world our report is advocating, then we'd be in a much, much stronger position. Instead of people sort of dying at home in awful circumstances with very little of support, there would have been much more community support.
Yeah, fascinating. And Libby, you're a practicing clinician. Maybe you could just add on to that your perspective about the last couple of years and what this commission means.
Yeah, so I was working as a palliative care clinician during the COVID pandemic, particularly when the first wave started. And I think for me, it really exemplified why this commission is so urgently needed for us to understand what our kind of relationship is, what our understanding of death and dying is today. And I saw two very polarising experiences of people's deaths and of people's bereavement at that time. I was seeing people at home, and often health services had completely withdrawn. There were no home visits, and people were caring for their loved ones with some video calls from healthcare professionals, but no other support, often very limited symptom control, so for breathlessness or any other symptoms. But what they did have was connection, strength, that ability to be together, to reflect on their lives, make sense, and connect with the people who were really important to them. And what I saw for people who were in intensive care or even just on the normal wards in hospital was that they had all of the kind of medical care and, ventilation, oxygen, and to some extent symptom control for breathlessness and other difficult symptoms. But their families were only connecting digitally by through FaceTime on iPads held up. And so these deaths were entirely devoid of all of that connection, that meaning, that ability to have those last conversations or reflect on your life or be present, and for that death to be part of that family's story. It was alien. It was something that they could never really experience fully. And that really demonstrates the kind of polarizing experiences, and it's an extreme example, but we see these polarizing experiences throughout all countries in the world. Either, we don't get the balance right, is what it seems to me, and that's one of the driving forces for me, and why I think this commission is important, because we need family and community connection. You need meaning and relationships at the end of life. You also need pain relief when you need it, and good symptom control and good medical care as and when you need it. But the balance has got completely wrong. And we see this throughout different contexts. And Raj, I'm sure, will tell us about, different settings, that this isn't something unique to the UK or to high income countries. This is something that we're seeing globally.
And maybe that could just lead us into the next sort of topic that I wanted to talk about, is this tension between low and middle income countries and high income countries, and under 5 mortality, which is obviously drastically bigger in low and middle income countries. And that the name of the commission, Value of Death, there is a suggestion that we've diminished the value of death in many high income countries, and that's actually, we've lost the focus on the value of life and the value of health. And Raj, I wondered whether you could just talk a little bit about your perspective on that tension and what it means to place a greater value on death in terms of how we perceive and frame health.
Advent of modern medicine and our current civilization has actually diminished the value of death and is more and more making death the enemy. It's actually happening. We have this paradox that 96% of people in my country and in most of the low and middle income world, which is 84% of the global population, has very little access to pain relief, symptom control. If you are breathless, you just get curative treatment and nothing else. On the other hand, despite that, when somebody is dying, then modern medicine steps in and provides life support. Forbidden death. You cannot die. If you have money in the pocket, you would still be put on a ventilator. And if you have more money, you will be put on an ECMO machine. Now, this is not only a matter of money. Certainly, it's a huge issue of catastrophic health expenditure, where in my country, 4% of the population is subject to catastrophic health expenditure every year. It's a growing destruction. That's on the one's part. But it's not only the money. We are taking away everything valuable surrounding the time of death, the time where you can receive a lot of love and give a lot of love, mend broken relationships, say I love you, be treated with a kiss on the cheek. All those things are being cruelly taken away. where people are shut down in intensive care units. And even in COVID-19, yes, death is more familiar. Death is more familiar as an enemy to be beaten at all costs, not as something that you live with. And after COVID-19, the devastation of families deprived of a final look or a final touch. You mentioned video calls. I know so many institutions where as soon as they enter the COVID ward, the mobile phone is taken away, put in a wrapper and stored. No contact. It's cruel. It's happening here.
And what does that mean for you in terms of the philosophy of death, in terms of what we place the importance on in the way that people die, and what this commission adds to that? I mean, do you set out a framework for how we should all die, or is this more explorative?
The most important thing, one of the recommendations of the commission is to familiarize death again to the society. It should, it's a matter for public discussions. In just a quarter of a century, death has been forbidden in intensive care units. The only way of changing that is for the public to be encouraged to think about it, talk about it. People who have gone through the difficult journey, people who have suffered the horror death of a family member, they have no voice now. They are there willing to speak. One of the things that needs to be done is to give them a voice, hear their voice, and over the next few years to make sure that the person on the street understands what is being done to themselves and to their families.
I mean, why have we diminished death? What's the historical, social, sort of socio-political analysis behind what's happened here? I know it's huge, but I mean, what are the three main reasons why we've done this?
Yes, I mean, I think you're asking me a very difficult question here. I mean, one of the crucial things in the report is a chart that makes a lot of comparisons between the 1950s and now. So I've already mentioned how death has become much slower. It's happening when people are much older. The technology has advanced enormously. You know, I mean, when we have drugs for cancer, as we have, that might cost £20,000 a year to administer and can keep some people alive for another few months. I mean, the technology has changed, but also the social context. I mean, probably back before the 1950s, death was much more to do with the church and religion than it was to do with health professionals. But clearly there has been a big decline in religious beliefs. So you asked me for three factors. Those are three I would pick out, but it's much more complicated than that. I mean, a central idea in this report is that, you know, death, like everything else actually, exists within a complex system. There are many, many different factors at work. You know, so you might start by saying, well, if people are being over-treated at the end of life, that's clearly the fault of doctors and health professionals. But it's not. There are all sorts of factors that are pushing both patients and doctors to go in that direction. So, you know, I think, unfortunately, that's sort of, it makes for quite a complex report, but I think it reflects a greater reality than saying, you know, here are three problems and here are four solutions.
No, I think that's right. It's the political economy of death, right? The market forces of driving death. I mean, anyway, Libby, you wanted to say something.
I wanted to pick up on one of the points that Raj made around the unfamiliarity of death and kind of the role that plays in where we find ourselves today. And I find seeing people at home as I go to care for them, if they've been referred into our palliative care service, people often talk about how unfamiliar they are, how frightening this is, how they've never seen someone die, they've never cared for someone in the last days of life. And at a table that we have in the report that Richard has alluded to, It describes how, life expectancy is increasing. People then have stopped dying at home. People are often dying in hospitals or in care homes or in other institutions. So it's kind of hidden away. Those final hours often people are not present for, or if they are, they're just sitting passively. They're not kind of actively caring. That's a job that's often done by nurses, doctors, healthcare assistants, other professionals. So there's kind of this sense that it's becoming increasingly unfamiliar and people don't have the skills. And the skills are kind of seen as this professional remit. Knowing what happens if someone's skin becomes cold or their breathing changes. These are kind of skills that actually in other times and certainly in other countries currently, these are kind of core human community skills that people know about and get passed on. But in certain particularly high income countries, these are being lost. So they're not being passed on. And that feeds this fear of death being something other, unfamiliar, that communities don't have the skills and confidence and shouldn't be managing. And so then that feeds into this kind of further professionalization. And that what is one of the kind of the real challenges, because then if, one of the main parts of the report is to say we must challenge this kind of over professionalization. We need good medical care, you need good symptom control, but it can't be the entirety of our response to death and dying. So when you ask and try to push professionals and institutions back, communities also need to feel confident to take this on. So there needs to be a way of supporting everyone to understand how to respond to death and dying. What do signs mean? How do you care for someone who's caring for someone else? How do you support them? How do you turn someone so that their skin is supported? How do you keep their lips moist? How do you support someone who's been bereaved? And these are kind of common skills that we need as human beings, because these are common universal events that will happen to us all. But somehow we've lost that sense that these are universal concerns for all of us, and we've lost the skills to respond to them.
That's fascinating. We're very shortly going to be interrupted by my son who's just coming back from school.
My children always come up to my laptop and read what's on it, and they say to me, they're little, 6 and 8, why are you always writing about death? It's not that interesting.
Yeah, so my children, who are much older, say, well, that's 20 seconds we've been meeting and you haven't mentioned death. That's a record.
But there's also an obsession that they go through with death, because it's such a huge thing. And we've gone through that recently with our 5-year-old who asks a lot about death and what it is and where it goes. And I fear that we try and make things up. You suddenly have these fears of you completely ruin their relationship with death for the rest of their life. You've spun them this tale.
I think it's an important point, thinking about kind of loss and death and pain and sadness. And these are normal human responses to things that will happen to us. And it's also very normal to want to protect each other and, to protect children, to protect your loved ones, your husband, your wife from these things. And those things are okay. They're normal responses. It's how we can't help but to behave. But the problem is that the entire society becomes colluding in that we try to pretend that actually it doesn't happen. And if we push death away, we don't see it and we don't have to deal with it, then actually we somehow save ourselves from the pain. But what happens is it comes back in another way. And actually that we talk about the gift of death. And again, this is quite a kind of obtuse concept, I think, to try and understand. But the gift of knowing someone's going to die, being able to be with them, supporting them in a way that they would want to, allowing them to die hopefully free of symptoms, that are managed in peace, having done the things they wish to do and having said the things they want to do with the people they wish around them, is an enormous gift. And we talk about this has been written in throughout history, of the gift of being able to give that and also to receive that sense of completion that you supported someone you love well. And there is something in that, in a kind of reciprocal gift relationship in that. And we try to unpick that in one of our panels.
Yeah, one of the things we examine in the report is the very serious amount of investment and science that is going into trying to achieve something close to immortality. I mean, it comes in various ways, and we describe those, but it's a massive enterprise. Yes, it seems to us very bizarre. It very much fits with the whole sort of West Coast, Silicon Valley kind of view of the world that, given enough time and resource, we can fix anything. And that that idea that we're out to try and defeat death, to get rid of it altogether. And I think it raises questions about, what exactly is medical research trying to do? I mean, there are massive, massive investments in trying to cure cancer. There are very tiny investments in palliative care research or helping people to die. And one of the things that this sort of made us think about is, well, we seem to be trying to defeat death, and that relates rather closely. Where does that idea that somehow we're masters of nature, not part of nature? That's exactly what has fed the COVID pandemic, that we somehow, we've ignored our relationship with nature. We've pushed wild animals out into the edge where there's an interaction with human beings. And then it also makes us think about climate change again. And there's a lot about climate change in this report, because I think the same idea that says we can defeat death suggests that we can kind of master the planet, that we can master nature. And I think that the way that these things come together is very central to the report.
And maybe, the reflections on climate change are really interesting. Maybe you could just expand on them just a little bit in terms of what that means about our perception of risk, our perception of where we are at the moment with climate change, and how we feel okay to dominate it and carry on as we're going.
Yes, perhaps the most useful thing to say is I am the chair of the UK Health Alliance on climate change, which brings together most of the medical royal colleges and the nurses and the pharmacists and the dentists, and does in fact include the Lancet. And it's made us reflect, or it's made me reflect a lot on the nature of our health system, that just like our whole economy is out of control, that we're consuming far too much, we're exploiting nature far too much. Actually, exactly the same thing is going on within healthcare. So, the NHS is 5% of the UK's health admissions. In the US, it's 12%. It's a massive, massive production, not only of greenhouse gases, but also of waste. A lot of the plastic that is in the oceans has come from healthcare. So, we in healthcare need to think about our own production, and that perhaps healthcare, and particularly I would say in the way we over-treat people at the end of life and spend enormous amount of resources on keeping people alive just a little bit longer, that our health system in some ways is as out of control as our economy.
To add on to what Richard said, yes, it's a matter of enormous cost and destruction of families. But it's much more than that. It's also prolongation of suffering. The person who could have been cared for and would have died in reasonable comfort in 2 days has the death being stretched out over a period of 2 months, not only at huge cost in terms of money, but also at an enormous expense in terms of the suffering of that person and of the whole family. It's a tragedy.
And we talk a bit about the kind of paradox of overtreatment and undertreatment that we see throughout all countries, whether high, low or middle income. There's huge variations within countries. And there's both kind of the overtreatment, and there's a huge literature on, futile treatments and the cost of treatments that are known to have no benefit. And yet, we're continuing to prescribe them. And then, there's potentially inappropriate treatments that are really unlikely to prove, to give benefit, but may, and people may wish to try them. And there's the kind of that overtreatment that, is uncontested. We know that is existing. And I think thinking not only of the financial cost and then of the kind of social justice and equity issue, that this is limited funds that cannot be used to be spent elsewhere in either the health or other areas of society, but also on the carbon cost of that now. And I think that's something that we need to start understanding, that if it's really, as treatments are really futile, then actually the carbon cost is something that needs to be taken in. And then that's kind of seen in parallel with the kind of shocking undertreatment of pain, of symptoms at the end of life, and this attention to kind of ideas of suffering that modern healthcare just cannot address. And the earlier Palliative Care Commission that Raj was part of really illustrates that, to demonstrate that it's one of the most shocking inequities of health at the moment, these, managing pain at the end of life with low cost, easily available opioids is something that should be universally available, and it's available to just a tiny proportion of the world. That's one of the most urgent challenges in terms of global health at the moment.
I just wanted to ask about COVID-19 because, there's some interesting conversations going on in the UK at the moment about what it means for levels of flu per year. Should we be allowing X number of people to die of flu each year when we know that there are things that we can do to stop it?
The reality is that there are many different causes of death. I think back to when I was I used to be the editor of the BMJ, and when I started there in 1979, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there was something like 10,000 deaths a year on the roads in Britain, plus enormous damage. For every death, there are many people who are seriously injured. And somehow, it wasn't debated very explicitly, but somehow that was accepted. And actually, it has been steadily reduced since. So I think there are many areas where there is some sort of implicit, often not well articulated calculation going on about how valuable lives are. And obviously, I suppose now people draw parallels. We know that there are deaths from flu every year, and it's to be expected that there will be deaths from COVID too. And it can't make sense to try and eradicate every last death. But I think if we were to talk about death and dying much more, perhaps we would be able to have these discussions in a more positive, open way. The report, we have a lot of analysis of costs at the end of life, and it comes out that something like 10 to 15% of the expenditure of health systems, this is not just the NHS, but across the world, is on people who die in that year. Now, if all of those people were having all sorts of suffering reduced and there was lots of benefit, then, perhaps that could be tolerated. Although that, viewed from a society point of view, to be spending 10 to 15% of the biggest, usually the biggest public expenditure is healthcare on people in the last year of life. Does that make sense in a broader view? Could we possibly have a discussion about that? It seems to be there's this awful tendency to think we've just got to treat this person, we've got to do everything we can to keep this person alive. And yet often, as Raj has expressed so beautifully, actually we're increasing suffering. We're not decreasing suffering. The sum of suffering is increased. So, viewed from an economist's point of view, that potentially looks like a very, very bad investment.
The whole narrative is quite kind of skewed because this idea of kind of the cure and, medicine has made huge increases in life expectancy and cure rates for many conditions, and, things that were previously lethal are now being cured. But I think the whole debate for me is just unbalanced and missing a key component that I hope this commission can kind of bring to the debate, is that if you avoid a death from any cause, X, Y, Z, that's not preventing death in itself. It will still happen at some point to that person from another condition. But the way the language is toned, it kind of is framed at the sense that it's been saved and death has been kind of defeated. It's been averted. And somehow we never quite acknowledge that at some point it will come. You think it's infinitely deferrable. And so the language is very dangerous in that way because it's beguiling. It makes you feel that we've defeated another death. That person will live forever. They can't and they won't. We don't want people dying from avoidable conditions. We want to avoid early deaths, and that's been one of the kind of achievements of public health. If you look at under 5 mortality, maternal mortality, death from communicable diseases, these are things that should be defeated, and we have the capability and we should do. But what we're not doing is defeating death per se. We're reducing deaths from avoidable causes. And so any push to increase our input into delaying death for these causes, say, for example, flu, should always be accompanied with an acknowledgement that death at some point will happen. And so increased funding and support should be going in parallel to supporting people as we know they will die, ensuring that suffering is managed, ensuring that sensible discussions are had ahead of time so that people can make decisions about the extent, the quality, the quantity of treatment they have, the wishes that their loved ones would have around that time. time, and that you can balance the kind of medical, physiological, biomedical input with meaning, sense, connection, existential issues that at the moment just have no place at that table.
I mean, one thing we look at in the report is the concept of a good death. You know, there's a lot of talk of a good death and lots of attempts to define a good death. But I think our general conclusion is that that's not, you know, it's sort of turning death and dying potentially into a sort of bureaucratic tick box exercise.
And I push even within palliative care, there's a kind of this tension between kind of the relational aspects of what's happening with, you know, people as people and understanding that context, and also the kind of kit that you need to get kind of to die at home, and that is a hospital bed, injectables, a district nurse referral, incontinence pads, a commode, you know, all these things. And they do, you know, for some people, they do really kind of empower them to stay at home, and they lead to great symptom relief. But they've become the whole purpose. And actually all they're meant to be doing is enabling you to stay at home, to then have these conversations, be part of whatever kind of community or conversations, whatever's important for you at that time to make sense of it. But they've become the whole centre stage. So the tick box list is there, and it's now kind of pushing out those other really important conversations and those kind of deathbed scenes where you're, you know, having conversations with people about what's important in that last opportunity. And that's, I think, been forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it's such a great topic, and it feels like just the beginning in some ways. This is the beginning of hopefully something more meaningful, something bigger. What did you have to miss out in the report that you want to carry on forward? What does the afterlife of the Value of Death Commission look like in an ideal world?
Certainly, right at the beginning of this commission, when we asked people what they wanted out of this, people said, well, what we really want is not just, you know, a written report. We want change. And we do have a lot of recommendations, and we plan to have further meetings moving all this forward. And I think that's going to involve a lot of research and a lot of thought. But I wanted to make the point that in the report we have the principles of what we call a realistic utopia. Again, an idea that Richard Horton shared with us that comes from the philosopher John Rawls. You know, not a utopia that's completely unachievable, but what would that look like? And we've described much of it during the podcast. And I think something that's very important in the report is that actually, I mean, Raj will deny this, but something not that far away from what we describe in the realistic utopia already exists in Kerala. So this is not something that, you know, is pie in the sky, completely unachievable, but it will require a lot of change. And to go back to this point about systems, it will require systems change. You know, it's not you can do three things and that'll be the end of it. It's going to be more complicated than that.
And just for our listeners, because everybody's now going to be wondering, what is going on in Kerala? Raj?
In Kerala, the successful experiment has been in giving healthcare back to the community, engaging the community. It started with the healthcare systems opening their doors to the community, engaging with volunteers from the community as partners, and they be allowed to participate in care process. And small communities emerge. They form their own initiatives to look after the ailing people in their neighborhoods. I would say it's more about life than death. People living with illnesses are cared for by the people in the locality, and then facing death becomes a natural sequence. What has become unfamiliar in 25 years is now being familiarized again. And Libby has done this in 30 counties in the UK, where again the community is getting engaged. We have known this for a long time. In 1978, the Alma Ata Declaration asked all countries to engage, to partner with the community. And in 2018, they reiterated and went one step further in the Astana Declaration and asked control over healthcare be given to the community. And everybody knows that this is to be done, but what has been achieved already has to be built on and spread on a much wider scale. It may not suit the healthcare industry very much. That's a challenge that we will have to face. It is a challenge. It is possibly the greatest challenge, whether it's about life or death. The greatest challenge could be that one. It's a huge issue, not easy to address, but the only way of addressing that challenge is also rests with the community.
Thanks, Raj. Libby, some final reflections?
Yeah. So we describe the idea of the realistic utopia and this set of principles that we hope will be a kind of catalyst for action, radical but achievable. The power does sit with all of us to make these changes, and we give recommendations through from civil society, governments, medical research funders, researchers, practitioners, right the way through. But we know that there are lots of examples of where this is happening already, and we give a great deal of time exploring and understanding the model in Kerala, which gives kind of the most comprehensive example of how you can do this across multiple systems. But we know there are examples, and we give a few in the report. But what we're hoping this report will stimulate is experiments for people in embedding, actioning, making the realistic utopia happen in their context. And we're going to build a collaboration to hear from people, so people can experiment, understand, feedback. And we're wanting a growing community really of practice, of innovators, of radical change makers to take on parts of this report, whatever resonates most with them and works most in their local context. And so we're looking for people to get in touch. We're going to be setting up a website, and there'll be a way that people can share these stories, experiences, experiments.
Huge thanks to Richard, to Libby and to Raj for speaking with us and sharing their thoughts there. For a bit of intra-Lancet chat, Jessamy and I are also joined by Dr. Jocelyn Clark, who's Senior Executive Editor at The Lancet and the person that's been managing this commission internally. Hello, Jocelyn. What I guess I'm keen to know is how this commission came about. What was sort of the philosophy behind the commission, I suppose, if you'll excuse the pun?
The Lancet, of course, is known for always being interested in the social and political contexts of issues of importance to health and clinical medicine. But here it was really important to surface a variety of different disciplines, philosophy, history, sociology, alongside some of the clinical disciplines like palliative care and others, so that we could begin to interrogate that unbalanced relationship between medicine and death and dying.
How do you think that this fits in generally with the Lancet? When people think about the Lancet, they think about medical publishing, the latest up-to-date scientific research. We obviously publish a lot of perspectives and philosophy, but this commission that's quite philosophical is quite a new venture, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is in some ways, because it probably seems to some readers that it's actually a bit contradictory or a bit of a conflict. That is, recognizing that death and dying in our societies are overly medicalized. But as a medical journal, having contributed in part to that medicalization, that we should be the ones to, convene a large group to kind of unpick that relationship and come up with new ways of rebalancing and visioning that relationship. But we have, a long history of being interested in the social and political, and as you say, the medical humanities as a context for understanding contemporary issues in health and clinical practice. So it does in some ways feel really natural to us. And it's certainly because it takes such a critical approach and brings on board these multidisciplinary perspectives to look at the relationship between medicine and death and dying. It's a great amount of value that we can bring as a medical journal to show our audience and readers that, the ways that death and dying are delivered now haven't been how they've been conceived of in the past.
And it's an extremely sort of fulfilling and emotive read, really, without being at all sad or sort of at all any form of a downer. It's a really uplifting read. What are some of the other pieces of work that are going alongside this or that are going to happen in the future?
I quite agree with you that the Commission, I feel exactly the same way. It is very emotive, but I feel like it has such a sense, a feeling of energy that it almost creates, a kind of outrage as a reader that that the contention that the Commission started with, death and dying, have turned into these phenomenon that are very much removed from family and community, overly medicalized, and that indeed there is a lot of fear and anxiety associated with it. So it's a very sort of motivating read, and it's incredibly readable, as you say, in the sense of really blending a lot of empirical data with analysis from these different disciplines, and setting out, some very, to some people this will seem very radical, this idea of a realistic utopia that the commissioners put forward. In addition to the commissioner's report in the Lancet, we have two other pieces. One is a commentary that's been written by Liz Grant, who's a global health scholar and clinician in Edinburgh, and her co-author Farzana Khan from Dhaka, Bangladesh. And they talk about the precariousness of balancing life and death, and really very much bring to this conversation the importance of looking cross-culturally and recognizing the various, contradictions, the nuances, the complexities of trying to rebalance this relationship that medicine and society have with death and dying, particularly from the perspective of lower and middle income countries. And then we also have a really wonderful profile of Roz Taylor, who is one of the commissioners of the Commission report and is the strategic medical lead at Harlington Hospice in London. And she's the former head of Hospice UK. So together, I think those are really nice pieces that frame and complement the Commissioner's report.
So, this has been the Lancet Voice. You can read The Value of Death Commission online now, completely for free, at thelancet.com. You can, of course, if you're not already, also subscribe to the Lancet Voice wherever you usually get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for another episode.